All right, great. Here we go then. Welcome and good evening. My name's Karen Kaplan, and I am responsible for programs for AAUW New Jersey. Come back to that in a minute. As Anjali mentioned in the chat, we are recording, and we ask that everybody stay on mute until we get to questions and answers and the conversation part of our evening. So a little background, AAUW, the American Association of University Women, as the members on the call know, is a 140-something-year-old organization that works toward equity for women and girls, and more broadly, equity for all. So at the national level, that involves advocacy and grants for women who are advancing the work, education, public education, and also research. And we'll be looking at some of that research this evening. At the local level, our 17, 18 New Jersey branches, I'm not sure of the number, support that national mission through local programming, scholarships awarded to young women in the area and returning to education, women who are returning to education, and local efforts to involve the community. And it's a great group to be a part of. So tonight's program was inspired by Equal Pay Day. And you may know that happened on March 25th this year. As many of you know, that's the day on which the average pay of women working full-time finally catches up to the average pay of men earned in the preceding calendar year. So it takes women an extra 3 months, roughly. It occurred to me that about 6 or 7 years ago, I went to an Equal Pay Day program that happened the first week of March or April. So now it's the end of March. Oh gosh, we must be making progress. But the progress, if it continues at the current rate, means that women's average pay won't equal men's for, it depends on what data you include, somewhere between 60 and I've seen 130 years. Which means my granddaughter and maybe her granddaughter, and my granddaughter's 3, means she'll be entering a workplace in which she's paid less than a man doing the same job, or likely would be. And that gap has enormous lifetime consequences for women's financial security. So tonight, our co-director of public policy for AAUW New Jersey, Anjali Mehrotra, will lead us through the most recent AAUW research on the pay gap and its implications. Couple words of history on Anjali. She is the founder of Equality Period, which is a menstrual equity coalition. It's had tremendous positive impact in New Jersey, particularly in the schools. She's a respected voice in both local and state politics. A grassroots activist, a woman tech entrepreneur. She served as president of Now NJ, and she's also the mother of 2 amazing young women whom I've met. So Anjali will lead us through the data and what it means for us. Now, we know that the pay gap is not just about individual pay decisions added up and averaged. It's also about a lot of factors behind pay, like hiring practices and promotional patterns and performance assessments and career support and so much more. So our second speaker this evening, Siri Chilazi, is going to take a look at some of those practices and the ways in which certain companies and individuals, which I think is the most important message here, is changing the workplace to make work more fair. And to tell you a little bit about Siri, she is going to be drawing on her new book. She's the co-author of Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results. And I'll tell you about my having read this wonderful book. Her co-author, Iros Bonet, is the co-director of the Women in Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School. And that's where Siri is a senior researcher. And I'm so excited to have her joining us tonight. So we have a great program. I want to, again, encourage you to put your questions and your comments in the chat. We will be answering questions and involving conversation, both around the data and also around the practices. And again, thanks so much for joining us. And let's get started. Anjali, all yours.
Thank you, Karen. Um, I'm just going to share my screen so that we can go through the latest data from AAUW. Is everybody able to see that? Yep. Okay, great. So as Karen mentioned, there is no doubt that the gender pay gap is something that is not just concerning. One of the things that is actually a little bit shocking, which we have actually seen a little bit of a backslide in the last couple of years. As you know, during the pandemic, there were a lot of factors that drove women out of the workforce, and this has had an effect on the gender pay gap. Um, so AUW is known for its research around the gender pay gap. It is something that is well respected in the policy world. AU's gender pay gap data for many decades now is used frequently by other organizations and on Capitol Hill when talking about equal pay. And this presentation is going to break down a little bit about what the gender pay gap is, what does it mean, its causes, its impact, and also what we can actually do to close it. The American Association of University Women, AUW, as we all know, is committed to pay equity and has been advocating for fair pay for over a century. My presentation seems to be stuck. Well, hold on one second.
I just want to reassure you all this is happening because we tested everything.
That's how it always goes. It works perfectly in the test, and then something crazy happens live.
Okay, I think we're good now.
It's back.
Um, Okay, so as I mentioned, despite the laws and the pay discrimination being illegal for over half a century, the gender pay gap remains a glaring inequity, and it undermines both workers' livelihoods and the strength of our economy. The challenges grow even larger and more complex when we bring in women of color, when we talk about LGBTQ plus women, women with disabilities, who face compounded inequities due to intersectionality. In the workplace, pervasive biases and discriminatory practices, as I'm sure Siri will talk about more, further cement these disparities. Underpaying and undervaluing women's work hurts not only women and families, it weakens the entire US economy. And this is why advancing comprehensive and inclusive strategies to address this issue will support opportunity for all. What does that actually mean? The earnings ratio, the pay gap is very simple using these formulas. In 2023, women working full-time year-round earned just 83% of the median annual salary paid to men, 55,240 compared to 66,790, leaving women and their families at a financial disadvantage. This earnings ratio shrinks to 75% when you include all working women, which is including women who work less than 35 hours a week or in seasonal jobs. These gaps cannot simply be attributed to differences in education, occupation, or time out of the workforce. Many women do not work full-time during a portion of their lives due to caregiving responsibilities. In 2023, women were twice as likely to work part-time than their male counterparts. When we include women who work less than 35 hours a week, It reveals that it is not just one gender pay gap, but many gender pay gaps, resulting in losses in earnings, benefits, and wealth. What is the impact of this pay gap? Well, we reduce workforce returns and retention. What does that mean? Mothers have 28 less lifetime earnings than women without children, and their earnings decrease by 3% for each additional child. Caregiving responsibilities and the high cost of childcare were cited as reasons for 79% of women who exited the workforce in 2021. Reduced lifetime earnings increases the financial vulnerability and dependency on safety nets for women. It results in the loss of Social Security retirement benefits, with mothers receiving 16% less benefits than women without children, and loss of economic productivity. Closing the gender pay gap could add billions of dollars to the US economy annually as predicted. From 1967 to 2021, the pay gap has cumulatively cost women $61 trillion in lost wages. What are some of the contributing factors? Job segregation. What does that mean? Women-dominated fields have seen consistently lower paid salaries than workers in fields dominated by men, even when jobs require the same level of skill, education, and training. And we see very familiar examples of this. And when we look at teachers, nurses, who in fact actually require more training and more skills than a lot of higher paid industries that primarily hire men. These jobs are also less likely to offer benefits like paid time off, health insurance, and retirement plans. Black and Latina women are even more likely to be employed in lower paying occupations, even after accounting for factors such as education, skills, and experience. For example, 39% of Latina women in the workforce were in jobs making less than $700 a week in 2022. The motherhood penalty, one of my favorite topics. Becoming a parent produces very different professional outcomes for women and men. Mothers are perceived to be less committed to their jobs and 6 times less likely to be recommended for hire than women without children. Because caregiving responsibilities fall disproportionately onto mothers, women are more likely to take time out of the workforce or scale back their hours. But this is not just an actual factual issue. This is also a perception issue, because statistics show that while women face a motherhood penalty, men actually get a fatherhood bump. They actually have more chances of promotion and their salaries going up if they are fathers rather than being, childless. And then, of course, there's employer practices. The use of prior salary history in setting current pay, prohibiting employees from discounting wages, lack of salary transparency, and retaliation against workers for discussing or disclosing wages contribute to the problem. By using salary histories, which may have been tainted by bias, it allows discriminatory pay to fellow workers wherever they go, regardless of their capabilities. Women in the public sector and in unions tend to experience smaller pay gaps, in part due to this increased pay transparency. And finally, actual gender and racial discrimination. Direct discrimination and bias against women in the workplace are major culprits in the pay gap. Each year, the EEOC receives thousands of sex, race, disability, and other pay discrimination complaints. Many of these are decided or resolved in favor of the person who filed the charge. This is a graph that actually shows the gender pay gap in more detail, broken out by race, because we know that race is an important facet impacting these disparities. America's history of slavery, segregation, and immigration policies has created deeply rooted systemic inequalities that continue to persist. And we cannot get away from that. Similarly, we see women's wages, also tending to increase with age, but then as the earnings increase more slowly after 35 and even decrease after age 50. So there's also further pay gaps based on age. And finally, education and the pay gap. As a rule, earnings increase as educational attainment increases for both men and women. However, women are more likely than men to enroll in college and earn college degrees, but this does not mean that it narrows the gender pay gap or increases their long-term financial security as well as men's does. At every level of education, women earn considerably less than men. The AAUW data and report breaks down the gender pay gap by state, and this is how New Jersey ranks. New Jersey ranks 24th, just below the US average. These state differences in gender pay gap can be influenced by variations in trade transparency, labor laws, access to affordable health care and childcare, union presence, education levels, pay leave, and also job segregation. So what do we do? How do we change this? Policy solutions, legislation is definitely a big way. Rigorous enforcement of the Equal Pay Act. As we all know, the Lilly Ledbetter Equal Pay Act was passed at the federal level. We also have a New Jersey version, which is the Diane B. Allen Pay Act, and real enforcement of those is really key to it. When I became president of Now New Jersey, I was often asked that question, why don't we have equal pay? What does that actually mean? Because we do have the laws, we do have actual legislation that basically says that equal pay is the law of the land. It's the enforcement that is the issue. So it is very important to know that until we provide protection for women to go and actually sue their employers if they are not being paid fairly, but not enough people take advantage of those laws. And of course, the employers, it is very hard to enforce that without actual legal action. But in terms of actual policy areas in other places, higher education support is a big part of it. Reducing barriers to obtaining a degree will make higher education more affordable, increase earning potential, and lower risk of unemployment for women. Policymakers should protect and expand Pell Grants and work-study programs for low-income students, support income-driven student and low repayment options, and allowing for expanded public service loan forgiveness programs will also help. Of course, all of these solutions are really at the federal level. And as you can note in the current administration and environment, there's not really a lot of support for this. But there are a bunch of things that we can actually do at the state level. And New Jersey actually has been sort of the leader in a lot of these policies. Paid leave. We have one of the highest paid leave programs and very, very strong family and medical leave initiatives in New Jersey. When it comes to making high quality, affordable childcare accessible, that is something that we still struggle with in New Jersey, even though legislators have tried to make some headway in that in the last few years. Reproductive health. Reproductive health is a big one, because if you don't have the ability to control your reproductive cycle and decide for yourself when and if you want to have a family, this can really play havoc with your long-term career and educational goals. And New Jersey has definitely been a leader in supporting reproductive health. These, as we know, are just the start. As I'm so sure Siri will go into much further, as we try to close these gaps, what can we do as AAUW members? We invite you to look at, AAUW's programs and policies. I will put the chat links both to the Simple Truth, or actually it's called the Not So Simple Truth, the 2025 update. And you should definitely read that, share that with your legislators, share that with your members of Congress, and urge them to take action. But you can take action too. And we always promote action at AUW. So I will also be dropping the link for AUW's 2-minute activist so that you can write to your representatives on issues. So we invite you all to become part of our activist network so that we can press our members of Congress to take action on these items. I am going to stop sharing my screen and I will see if there's any questions in this chat. Seeing no questions, I'm going to pass it to Siri so she can take us into more detail on, how we can not just, change, close the gender pay gap, but also make work places more inclusive for women specifically. Thanks, Siri.
Erin, did you have a question before I dive in?
I wondered, Anjali, I know you've been in policy conversations at the state level. I don't know if they've focused specifically on legislation concerning equal pay. Do you find New Jersey legislators in particular open to these conversations? Are they aware of the issues? And should we all be writing to our state legislators to say this is still something we want you to pay attention to?
So New Jersey, actually, when Governor Murphy got elected in 2017, I think the first bill that he signed was actually Equal Pay Act. So New Jersey has actually stronger equal pay laws than the federal, which means that women who, choose to bring legal action against the employers for not being paid fairly, can look back many more years than the federal law gives them. So the statute of limitations is much longer in New Jersey. I think it's like 15 years or something like that. And also, when it comes to things like family leave, we have one of the strongest laws in the nation. I think childcare still, as I mentioned, tends to be a challenge. But in terms of one of the things that we passed actually just last year was a pay transparency law, which now requires that all employers in New Jersey, when they're posting either for a promotion or a new position, they have to include a wage range as well as the benefits, because we know that when those ranges are not disclosed and it is left to the total discretion of the hiring manager, women face discriminatory and practices and bias and tend to be given lower wages. So we did actually pass that law in New Jersey. I think New Jersey legislators, for the most part, I have found to be very, very open when it comes to these issues. Most of these are bipartisan. I think we get support from both Democrats and Republicans on most of these. Of course, we always have the naysayers, and the business community always sort of fights us on some of these issues, but I think the legislators are pretty open on them.
Great, thank you. Okay, now I will hand it over to Siri. I do want to mention, I read Make Work Fair partly on a plane, which is not a great reading environment, and I still found it really readable, practical, engaging. So I recommend it just as an inspiring book, particularly for women who are actively working, and for those of you who know women who are working and can pass along some of the wisdom and the wonderful ideas in it. And one of the first stories in that book concerns an individual taking on data collection. When I think about data as a factor in making work more fair, I think of big computer systems and all kinds of processes and so on. And here's somebody with a pencil who really made a difference. And so I particularly like that point of view, that any individual can make a difference. And I know that'll be one of Siri's points. So, okay, so I'll stop talking now and hand over the mic. Thanks, Siri.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much for your kind words and your generous introduction. Anjali, thank you for that amazing presentation. You've given us all the data at our fingertips that really helps put this next part into context. Because just like Anjali was saying, while there is that unexplained portion of the pay gap where we can't really understand statistically where it comes from, and our best guess is that it's because of bias or discrimination, that unexplained share of the gender pay gap has actually been shrinking over time, which is good news. And today, the two biggest drivers of the gender pay gap are the fact that men tend to be in more senior roles compared to women, even when they're working in the same company or the same industry. And then, as Anjali mentioned, the fact that women and men tend to work in different jobs, and the jobs that women are represent the majority in, like teaching, nursing, a lot of caretaking and health related occupations, are just across the board systematically more lower paid than occupations dominated by men in, for example, manufacturing, infrastructure, and technology. So in order to address some of these broader drivers of the gender pay gap, the so-called occupational segregation and then the hierarchical segregation, we need to start looking more holistically at how to make work fair. And I'm excited to share with you some real world examples and some research based examples, also from the real world, from real organizations, about how we might actually go about doing this. When I say fair, I just want to define that real quick because to make sure that everyone has the same definition that we're working from. When my co-author and Iris and I talk about making work fair, what we mean is ensuring that everyone has the same opportunity to both have access to the workplace, and then once they're there, gets the same resources and support to succeed in order to do their best work. So think of the analogy of the 100-meter dash. This is why I have the picture up on the slide. The way we can tell who the fastest sprinter is because everyone shows up at the same starting line, they finish at the same finish line, and in between, they run on the same track with the same equipment, the same sneakers, and the same outfits. But if we had some people start 20 meters behind, now they would always finish last, but that's not necessarily because they're not equally as fast or even faster than everybody else. It's because they're at a structural disadvantage because we force them to start 20 meters behind. Or if we make some people run barefoot while other people get sneakers, well, that's not a fair race either. That's not the best way to determine who the fastest sprinter is. So in order to have a fair race, we need to have everybody starting at the same starting line, experiencing the race in the same conditions. And that's exactly what this looks like in the workplace as well. It's not about everybody making it to CEO because not everybody has the skills to get there. Not everybody also wants to get there. People have different priorities and preferences in life. But it's making sure that we can harness the fullest contributions of everybody, women, men, and everybody else in our workplaces so that people can rise as high as their potential and their preferences allow. And the core argument that we make in the book is that making work fair is not a program, but it's a way of doing things. So this is not about going to another unconscious bias training session or a networking session or starting more employee resource groups, for example. Because as wonderful as those might be, as much as people sometimes love them, well, first, there's not a lot of evidence to back up their effectiveness. But even more importantly, those types of programmatic interventions are off to the side. There's something extra to put on your plate after you've finished your long workday, doing the things that you already must do. They also are often extra one-off separate line items in the budget that when there's an economic downturn or when there's political pressure, those types of line items are easier to cut than, say, stopping hiring people or stopping performance evaluations or stopping creating products, which are the lifeblood of companies, and they will continue to happen no matter who sits in the White House or whether the market is up or down. So the key is to embed fairness into all the things that we're already doing on a daily basis, whether that's running meetings, writing emails, giving feedback to a colleague, picking who should be working on which assignment. It's all those everyday decisions. And I'd like to suggest to you the way we really embed fairness into all of these daily actions is by making fairness count, by making it stick, and by making it normal. So let me give you a quick example of each of these before we dive into the conversation. Roz Atkins, the gentleman you see here on the left, is a career journalist at the BBC based in London. And this is the story that Karen alluded to a moment ago when she was talking about how even individuals can make a difference. So Roz, at the time, was a presenter in a primetime nightly news show. And he realized that as much as he cared about representativeness and high quality in his journalism, he actually didn't have any data on hand to know whom he was featuring as contributors and expert commentators on his nightly show. So he decided, along with his team, to start generating the data himself. After every night's show, Raz and his team would take a pen and a post-it note and actually go through the run of show and count how many people did we feature on screen during our 60 minutes on air, how many of them were women, how many of them were men. Not terribly complicated. And they counted every day after each night's show. And then after a month, they averaged out all the data to realize that only 39% of the people they were featuring on screen were women, a lot lower than they actually suspected and had expected. So they then set themselves a goal of getting to 50-50 because the world is roughly 50-50 in terms of women and men. And in 4 months, they got there by being more thoughtful about whom they sourced as contributors, by cultivating more talent on the bench so that, for example, instead of having just one aviation expert who they tapped every single time there was an aviation related news story, they now had 4 or 5 people who could speak really credibly to aviation and offer different perspectives on a rotating basis. So once they had proven the concept of counting, simple data-driven change in representation on their own show, Roz and team then set out to share their approach with a whole variety of other colleagues in the BBC who led their own TV shows or radio programs or even produced digital content on the website. And I'm going to fast forward to today, where 7 years later, more than 750 content creating teams around the BBC globally have joined this data-driven movement to equalize representation in the media. It's formally become known as the 50-50 Equality Project. And besides the BBC being on board, they've got more than 150 external partner organizations globally, including other media companies and journalism schools, to join. So this is just, I hope and feel, a hopeful story of how one person who is not the CEO, who is not the head of HR, who has no organizational power to compel anyone to do anything, not even a budget to incentivize people to do what he wants them to do, how this individual can nonetheless make a small change in how he does his own work, make his own work more fair, and in so inspire thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of other people around the globe to join him. So that's making fairness count. Making fairness stick is all about making small structural changes into how we do our everyday work. I want to share with you the example of one of the largest employers in Australia, which had done the counting. It had looked at its data and it discovered that among people who had applied to leadership roles but gotten rejected, men were almost twice as likely as women to reapply for another leadership opening in the future. So on the graph on the right, this is the 2 bars on the left where we see control. You see a blue bar that's almost twice as high as the red bar. So that indicates that men in the blue bar are almost twice as likely as women to reapply to other leadership positions in the future. And this organization, of course, wanted more people, especially women, to reapply because these are high potential individuals. They've already made it pretty far in the hiring process. They just didn't get this one job this time, but they want to keep those same folks in the pool for other openings. So, in partnership with researchers, they made a super, super small change to their process. That process already entailed sending the top 20% of rejected applicants an email that said, "Thank you so much for applying. You didn't get the job this time, but we really hope that you'll reapply for other similar positions going forward." So the small tweak that they made is they just added one sentence that explicitly stated, "We'd love for you to reapply. You were in the top 20% of applicants for this position." and giving people that additional information about where they stood relative to others, reducing ambiguity. As you can see in the second set of bars, it increased women's likelihood to apply. It also slightly reduced men's, and in so doing, it closed the gender gap in reapplications. The third set of bars refers to another part of the experiment where they also followed up by phone with the applicants to encourage them verbally to reapply, and it didn't turn out to make a meaningful difference. The email was enough already to close the gender gap. So just that small tweak of adding that one sentence, a little bit of additional information in the email, made a huge difference for the kind of talent pool that this company was able to tap for their leadership roles. And of course, this has a direct connection to the pay gap as well, because we know that the more women we can get into the highest levels of leadership, the more we can close the gap. That's the essence of making fairness stick. And finally, I want to share with you one example of making fairness normal. This making fairness normal is all about embedding it into the informal everyday interactions, sometimes even formal policies, like around parental leave, for example, that govern what we think of as being normal in the organization. What does the organization value? How do we do things around here? And this story comes from Novartis, the pharmaceutical company, a global pharmaceutical company based in Switzerland. They wanted to increase employees' sense of inclusion and especially psychological safety, which is our comfort in taking interpersonal risk, such as by challenging a senior leader or being the only person in the meeting says, "How about option B?" when everyone so far has spoken up in favor of option A. It requires an environment where you feel like you're not going to get penalized for taking an interpersonal risk like speaking up. So Novartis decided to tackle a very specific frequent behavior in the organization, and that was the meetings that take place between managers and their direct reports. And again, long story short, they tested a variety of guidelines to give to managers about how to conduct these meetings. And there was one guideline that was by far the most effective at increasing inclusion and psychological safety. And it was the guideline that asked managers to talk less, listen more, and turn over control of the meeting to their direct report so that their colleagues had a chance to voice their needs and aspirations. So sometimes something as simple as, if you're a manager, conducting your meetings in a way that gives other people more of an opportunity to voice their concerns and opinions can be a way to make work fair. Another great quick example I'll finish on is a study from the UK from Santander Bank, which looked at men's support for flexible working. That support was actually at 99%. But when men were asked, how many of your colleagues do you think are supportive of flexible work? Only two-thirds thought other men would be supportive. And when we closed this gap in perceptions, when we informed these men, you know what? Actually, everyone like you loves flexible work. Their intentions to take more parental leave went up significantly, 15 percentage points, which represented a 62% increase. So sometimes we tend to have miscalibrated ideas of what other people think. And when our beliefs are corrected, when the accurate information is shared with us, it allows us to act more in line with our beliefs and values and intentions. Like these men who had wanted to take more parental leave all along, but didn't feel like they were socially able to. So I could share a lot more, but I'm really eager to hear your questions and thoughts. So I'm going to pause there. I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you're on LinkedIn as well, I'd love to connect with you there. And I also have my email up here on the slide in case you'd like to continue the conversation or have any more questions. But with that, let me stop sharing the screen, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts.
So while we're waiting for people to post, I'll start off with some questions. There are a lot of different places. Is there a good place to start, or just wherever you are? Is the
Mm,
1, 2, 3 a
mm,
sequential 1, 2, 3, or is it again wherever you see an opportunity?
mm, mm. So, in an ideal world, I would suggest people and organization to direct their efforts to where they're most needed. And so, data is very helpful there to help us identify pain points, right? And issues. So, should we anonymize resumes as part of hiring, where we take people's names off the top, maybe the names of their educational institution? Because there's a lot of research that suggests that people's names in particular can introduce a lot of unnecessary gender and racial bias into the process. Well, my answer to that is I'm not sure if you should do that, because I need to look at the data for your recruitment process to understand whether you have a problem with bias in recruitment at the moment or not. So we have a certain set of applications that come in, then we review those resumes. Does the pool of people who makes it through the resume screen, does it have the same proportion of women and men and people of color and veterans and everything else as the original pool of applicants? Or does something happen at the resume review stage where we advantage some candidates and disadvantage others? Only the data will tell. So we have to let the data speak before we decide which interventions make sense. But that said, something like the example of the Australian company of providing just more information to people and reducing ambiguity about reapplications, that's probably an intervention that makes sense to do, even if there isn't even if you don't know yet whether there is a gender pay gap or gender gap in applications today. Because a lot of research that just shows that when we reduce ambiguity and increase the transparency of pay and also how we work more generally, that helps to level the playing field for everyone.
Right. Okay. So this is a question that postdates your research, but we're seeing a lot of pullback from diversity, equity, and inclusion, certainly in the government, but also in businesses, some businesses, and even some educational institutions. Obviously, that affects a lot of different groups in different ways,
Yeah.
but speaking about gender inequity, particularly in the workplace, do you see that kind of pullback affecting the workplace and the movement toward fairness?
So I think it's very important here to distinguish between what we see in the media and what companies and individuals are saying publicly, and then what's actually happening on the ground. Because the public conversation, as we know, is very polarized. So we're likely to see in the media extreme opinions on either side instead of the big middle that tends to be much more sort of moderate and reasonable in terms of the positions that they take. So I think that's exactly what's at play here right now. As I've been on book tour for the last couple months, talking with hundreds of organizations and thousands of people, what I'm seeing is, because of the uncertainty and because of the sort of increased risk or perceived increased risk, people and companies are much less willing to talk about what they're doing publicly. Most of them, though, are continuing their efforts silently in the background. So I think that's the good news. The even better news is that I think this moment, this as fraught as it is, as uncertain and risky and scary as it can feel, also is a moment for us to get even smarter about the practices that we're deploying. So let me give unconscious bias training and diversity training as an example. Those have been very popular practices for many, many years. In fact, they've been around since the 1960s. We've also been studying them since the 1960s. And the evidence across hundreds of studies is really clear that training doesn't lead people to change their behavior. As much as people sometimes enjoy these trainings, as much as they learn new things in these trainings, we just don't see people concretely changing what they do as a result of these trainings. And as researchers, we've been trying to share this message with practitioners for decades now, and it hasn't quite sunken in. Right. So this moment represents an opportunity to reevaluate some of the things that we have been doing, like trainings, and say, wait a second, they haven't worked anyway. Now they're becoming increasingly risky. Might this be an opportunity to pivot away from those trainings and instead make some of these small tweaks into our everyday processes around hiring, performance evaluation, work allocation, promotions, that research has shown to be much more effective at yielding real measurable results and real measurable progress for gender equity. So I think sometimes less talk and more action is not a bad thing.
Great, thank you. Um, have you, in your conversations, come across a concern among women that coming forward with suggestions on that might de-bias, let's
Mm,
say, the
mm,
workplace, um, result in a certain branding, like, oh, she, the equity woman, always coming to the
mm,
table with another way we can change things. Is that a concern, or no, that's
mm.
kind of in the past?
Interestingly, that hasn't come up so much as a concern that I've seen from individual women, but there are research studies showing that when women and people of color, especially in leadership, advocate for equity and for sort of DEI as we might think of it traditionally, it's less well received than when white men advocate for those same things, which is interesting, right? Because there is something about this perception that you're just trying to promote the interest of your own group, whatever that group is, that's viewed more negatively than when you are advocating on behalf of others, on behalf of a group that you don't belong to. And I think there's a lesson for all of us here around messaging and framing. Um, I'll give you another quick example of a research study that looked at resume formatting. The traditional resume format has lists your experience with specific dates attached. And in that format, career gaps become very obvious. So if your one experience ended in 2015 and the next one started in 2020, a recruiter is going to look at that and say, but wait, what were you doing between 2015 and 2020? And why is there a gap here? And we know that employers penalize candidates with such non-continuous work histories. And of course, that tends to disproportionately disadvantage women because, like Anjali already was mentioning, women are still more likely to have career gaps on their resume for various reasons, one of which is caregiving. So that gap was totally closed when the resume was reformatted such that you have your experience listed with the total number of years. So 5 years management consultant, 10 years senior project manager. Now it's less clear. It's the kind of potential gaps have been obscured. And actually, both women and men were more likely to get called in for an interview with the reformatted resume. So this is an example of a process change, a small design change that levels actually the playing field for everyone, benefits everyone, but benefits women a little extra because women have been the one who have suffered from the status quo, from the previous design of the resume the most. But I think the framing around when we make work fair, when we just create smarter, more fair, more objective processes, that actually makes the workplace better for everybody. That's a really powerful one to overcome potential backlash and to make people see that fairness is really everybody's work. We both all have to be participating in making work fair. We also all benefit on the other side from fairer workplaces.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
Thank you.
I want to ask about the lists, the best companies for women type lists. There's a
Mm.
few of them out there. Um, do they actually help move the needle, or do they tend to be based on programs that accommodate the needs of women, which makes women's lives at work easier? Maybe it allows them to return to work, but doesn't actually de-bias the workplace. Any thoughts on that?
So I think social comparisons are very important, right? So rankings, especially when people are ranked, people or companies are ranked alongside others whose opinion they care about, right? So companies in a particular industry, for example, like pharma or consumer goods or finance, they often care about what other pharma and consumer goods and finance companies are doing because they consider them their peers and competitors. There's a lot of research showing that rankings, and especially finding yourself at the bottom of a ranking, can really motivate behavior change because we want to be seen as doing well and gaining respect among our peers. My biggest question on the rankings really would be, to your point, are they based on just the availability of things like parental leave, as sort of inputs, if you will, or are they based on actual results or outputs, such as the share of women in leadership, the share of women, size of the pay gap in that company? Have they done even a pay gap audit to know what their pay gap is? How quickly women are advancing through the organization compared to men. One pattern that we often see in research is that women spend less time at a given rank in a given role before getting promoted to the next level, whereas women spend more time. That to me is an indication of inequity or unfairness in the promotion process and everything that leads up to it. So I generally love to start seeing companies focus a little bit more on those actual results and outcomes, outputs, rather than just the inputs, even though both are, of course, important.
Great, thank you. We do have a question in the chat for Anjali. Do we have any AAUW people who actually worked on the New Jersey legislation on equal pay? Anjali, you want to jump in on that one?
Sure. So that legislation honestly was passed in 2017, early 2018, actually, which was before I got involved with AUW, or even now, actually. So I don't know that I can answer that question. I know that that was a piece of legislation that was pending for many years under the previous administration. And when Governor Murphy was running for his first term, that was a campaign promise. So he was very quick to fulfill that once he was elected.
Thank you. Any other questions or any personal experiences with addressing fairness in the workplace? Look for a chat or for a raised hand. Anyone?
While we're waiting for questions, I would like to add one more call to action of my own. I love the ones that Anjali offered, but my call to action today would be to follow in Roz Atkins's footsteps and think about what's something in your work or in your life or in your family, some small change that you could make to make your work, your life, your family more fair. Because we all have some kind of system that we control, right? If you're the head of HR in a big company, okay, you control a lot of systems, and with the stroke of a pen, you can change them for hundreds and thousands of people. But even if you are retired, if you're a solo entrepreneur, if you run a small business, there's a lot of things within your control. And I think one sort of thing that Roz Atkins always inspires me with is the idea to focus on the things that we can do and the things that we can control instead of the things that we can't. And we can make changes beyond our wildest dreams by taking that approach.
That's inspiring. Great way. So we had a couple of comments come in and we still have 3 minutes, and I'm going to use them. From Arna and Wayne, what statistical tests did you use? And I assume, Arna, you were talking to Siri. I'm also a statistician.
So, I included all the references to the studies on the slides. So it's a variety. Roz Atkins, that was just a case study, not a statistical analysis. The other two examples that I mentioned from Australia and the UK are randomized controlled trials. So there was a variety of statistical analysis, including multiple regressions involved, but happy to send you the references so you can dive in deeper.
Thank you. The p-values are very small. So that was wonderful to see.
Yes, yes. And we try to go for the biggest samples possible so that we can get that statistical significance.
Thanks.
Arna, thanks for that.
Absolutely.
And Catherine O'Connell wrote in an example of what company is voluntarily applying pay transparency across all US states, not just the ones that have a law like New Jersey. Do you have some examples of companies that do practice pay transparency across the board?
Oh, off the top of, I just don't want to misspeak here because I'm not 100% sure which companies do this across the board. But that's such a great example too of how legislation, even if it's at the state level and doesn't require federal level action yet, can often precipitate federal action, right? Because companies start reporting in one state and they realize, well, we might as well report in other states. Another great example of this is regulation from the EU, such as the GDPR, the privacy regulations. They technically only apply to EU and companies doing business in the EU, but because so many American companies have a presence in Europe, they've just started adopting those privacy policies that are much more advanced and strict than what we have in the US as well. So sometimes change starts smaller in one place and then spreads from the bottom up instead of from the top down.
And where is transparency reported? How and where could somebody just look up that data?
So in the US, since we don't have any federal reporting requirements, it would be basically company by company. My home state of Massachusetts actually just passed a law last year, so last fall, that will require starting next year companies to submit their data to the state, and the state will report it in an anonymized and aggregated fashion every year. So in some states, like in Massachusetts, you will be able to go actually to a state level database to look some of this up. But in the meantime, you'd basically have to go company by company or organization by organization to see what they report, at least here in the US.
Thank you. We are at 8 o'clock. I want to draw everyone's attention to a few follow-ups that are in the chat. So a column that Anjali authored for Insider NJ on what New Jersey needs, pay transparency. And there are also links to the Make Work Fair book site, to the Take Action AAUW org 2-minute activist, and the data. So I really encourage all of you to take a minute to copy those into your own notes and take the action that we've talked about, that Siri suggested, that Anjali's enabled. And I think we actually can make a difference here. Thank you so much for joining us. If there are additional questions, we're happy to stay on. But we're glad you joined us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure.